And welcome back. You're listening to Amrard Esoteric Adventures. I'm your host, Freyawen, and today we are going to be taking a look at pagans, henotheism, and mysticism. Pagan theology, religious philosophy, and metaphysics. Now, as always, I like to introduce myself and my credentials pertaining to the topic at hand. Now, I am a rank amateur. My degree is in ecology. I am not a religious studies major. I do not work in anthropology or fields such as for a living. I am, however, an initiate of the school of Eleusis, the mystery school of Eleusis, which gives me at least as much authority as anybody else to think about these things. I invite criticism on all points. I like to be corrected. I like to be called an idiot. I like to be pointed out how little I know about anything. And I like to share my thoughts and my opinions, which is why this channel exists. So take everything I say with the biggest grain of salt that you can find in the salt shaker. I want to present a problem, and that's the seminarian problem. The problem from doing pagan metaphysics and pagan theology in general is that we don't really have seminaries. We don't have degrees. We don't have, there are some institutes that offer such degrees, but kind of an open question as to what kind of authority they can possibly have. Because the idea of having a seminary and an orthodoxy and these type of things, these are not native to religions that we would classify as pagan. These are distinctly kind of Abrahamic, world religion kind of ideas from organized religions, right? So basically, everyone is an amateur or else they're an archaeologist. And this kind of leads to the central problem of, the so-called New Age movement, which is that nobody seems to know what it is or nobody seems to know what they believe. And in some ways that's a beautiful thing. We have strength and diversity. There are as many paganisms as there are pagans, perhaps, but we have to have an educated, enlightened, intelligent response to criticisms that we will face or to ideas that we will come across in the world, because if we can't justify why we think something, then why do we think it? The unexamined life is not worth living, as Socrates said. So what we have in terms of mystical traditions, metaphysics, and mystical theologies, which, if you ask me, all theology is mystical theology, what we have are initiatory traditions. This is the same as in Christianity, and this is a theme that we're going to tease out a lot through these videos. I think there's going to be a lot of these videos, but a theme that we're going to tease out is that pagans typically call themselves pagans in response to a religion that they were brought up in the West, most often Christianity, and they're defining their worldview and their identity in opposition to the religion that they came from, which I think often leads to overreactions and misunderstandings, and to some extent that's sort of exploited to kind of get these people into the group, as it were, whatever that might mean to different people, to get them to move from the religion that they grew up in into calling themselves pagans. But there's actually a lot more in common that we have, for example, with the Christians than a lot of people might think. Particularly the Catholic and Orthodox Christians, because of the fact that this is an initiatory tradition. I think that the Protestant version of Christianity presents a certain kind of complete antithesis to our worldview, because they have, a Bible and they swear by it and they base everything that they believe off of a specific text, so that the one thing that they really believe is that text is infallible, right? Muslims believe the same thing about the Quran to a stronger degree. In fact, you'll often see Catholics and Orthodox Christians criticizing Protestants, saying that they are like Muslims because they put all their faith in a book. And this really is something that is entirely antithetical to how we are thinking about religion and metaphysics and beliefs and practices and everything, right? Paganism, and particularly the mystical version of it, is an initiatory tradition. It is something fundamentally experienced. We have faith in things that we have experienced, not in things that are written. It's not that things that are written aren't useful. They're useful for knowing what was believed at one point in time. They are useful for preserving certain texts, liturgical texts, across time, but they're not infallible teachings, that, I discovered this ancient text or someone described a belief in Thor as the thunder god, so I have to believe infallibly that that's a teaching. That's not how any of this works. I was inspired to make this video by reading the work of Dillon, who interestingly has converted to Christianity since he wrote his books, but he wrote books arguing for a polytheistic metaphysics. He's one of my big sources here. I highly recommend you go out and check out really all of his books. And I'm going to try my best to cite where I have received certain teachings and ideas from, to avoid being accused of just kind of making stuff up. But where I do make stuff up, you're just going to have to accept that what it is. So, let's really get into pagan metaphysics, and where else would we start but with Plato? Platonism is the best metaphysics available to us, I think. If anybody wants to have deep metaphysical discussions and kind of denounce Plato's beliefs entirely, we could have that discussion. But for me, we're going to be beginning and ending kind of with Plato, and specifically with his sort of henotheistic beliefs. A lot of people say that Plato was a precursor to monotheism or to Christianity because he taught the belief in like a single transcendent God. And the assumption is that this is not what people had believed in beforehand. That's difficult to really say. In some ways, when we're talking about things this esoteric, we can't really expect the ancients to have good writings that are going to clearly tell us what they thought about such things. But it was Plato who came up with the idea, as we know it, of the one, the Henad, the transcendent Godhead that is beyond being. And that's an important concept, is to be beyond being, to transcend being, to transcend the world. Dillon wrote that to be divine is to transcend the world. This gives us a starting point for talking about what exactly gods are, and that's something that might or might not actually be a large part of this video. We will see. But what Plato does is he resolves the problem of the one and the many, right? If you have only the many, if you have only many people, many beings, and many gods, it becomes impossible to really speak of what these things are, having no shared identity. But when you speak of their shared identity, their form, as it were, you suddenly get abstract and disconnected from anything that really exists. So the short version of this argument, as Dillon presents it, is really kind of beautiful, and it's based on matter and form. If you're not familiar with Platonism, here's kind of the quickest crash course that I can give you in the philosophy, as it were. You take any object, anything that you can think of, and it has two aspects. It has its matter and its form. Its matter is what it physically is, the particles, the subatomic particles and everything that make up a certain body. And the form is what the thing is as a whole. So you take a cup and you have a certain mass of ceramic and paint that is formed into a certain, say it had formed, right? A certain mass that is, the object that you hold in your hand, but it has been formed into the shape of a cup. It fulfills the function of a cup by having that form. The better, I guess, analogy, the classic analogy or classic example, has to do with the apple and the redness of the apple, right? The apple is physically a thing. It has its particles arranged in a certain way that cause it to reflect red light. But the redness is not physically the apple. The redness is not physically the same thing as the red light. You could say that it's the perception. Again, I'm trying to give you the condensed version here, but I think you get the idea. So classical Platonism has to do with the idea that, for every table or cup or apple, there is the transcendent idea of tableness, cupness, appleness that exists in an abstract way, kind of in heaven, as it were. And that, everything is made up of both its matter and its form. Well, if everything consists of matter and form, then there must be an explanation for how matter and form are together, right? Did matter create form? Did form create matter? Do the two create each other? All three of these possibilities are debunked philosophically, kind of from first principles, because form cannot create matter, since form doesn't exist apart from matter. In other words, there is no redness without an apple to be red or something to be red, right? And vice versa, the matter cannot create the form, because formless matter would just be an undifferentiated kind of mess. It wouldn't be comprehensible. We can talk about this. I will probably talk about this in like different creation myths that usually talk about formless matter. But what matters to understand is that form and matter cannot create each other, and they can't create each other at the same time either, because if they're working together to create each other, then they're already, conjunct. Stephen Dillon gives a great version of this. I need to dig it up and possibly insert it here in an aside or something. Anyway, so it's proven in that way that matter and form are kind of created and made conjunct by a transcendent creator, a transcendent God that transcends both form and matter. The formula that kind of gives this is that its form is matter and its matter is form. This same exact argument, constructed as such, is then applied to being and existing. God, is that what it is? Essence and existence. You'll have to. We're gonna edit that out. Essence and existence, right? So essence and existence can't create each other. Neither can essence, existence kind of like become conjunct without already being conjunct, is the best way I can put that. And so there's a God whose essence is existence. It's not that he exists, it's not that he has existence, it's not that he has an essence, but his essence is existence. This is classical Platonism, and it applies equally to Christianity and to paganism. But the idea is that it presents us with a being that can take many forms. How does it take many forms? This is kind of getting real abstract, and I'd like to get into it later. But what it essentially boils down to is the idea that there is no longer a dichotomy between one God and many gods, or between one being and many beings, one person and many people. We have resolved the problem of the one and the many by transcending it in appeal to a completely transcendent entity, being God, that is beyond such dichotomies and causes them to come to be. I think mysticism as a, theological tradition has always kind of revolved around this idea, this dichotomy between God and creation. We mortals naturally understand ourselves to be created and finite, and yet we are capable of comprehending the infinite, right? These themes appear across human culture everywhere in the world, right? And so I am a bit of a perennialist, and I think that a certain version of the interpretatio, as they call it, is appropriate, which is to say that similar beings that appear in the mythologies of different cultures can be identified one as the other, so that, of course, Jupiter and Zeus are clearly the same thing, Ares and Mars are clearly the same thing. This is natural and obvious when talking about Greek and Roman deities. It becomes more complicated with other pantheons, but it becomes obvious that it is possible and feasible to an extent kind of everywhere. What that really goes to show is that the gods are what they are in the mythology. If a given mythology has a role for a god, then that role, that mytheme we sometimes call it, is fulfilled elsewhere. So for example, the mytheme of the dying and rebirth god is fulfilled under many names. You'll have to forgive me. I think it's Osiris in Egypt, and I think it's, obviously, you have Jesus and you have the descent of Inanna, right? So you have commonalities with different kind of dressings, and this is considered to be entirely appropriate, at least in the broad sense. We can get into the specifics. We will get into the specifics. But this kind of takes us into a discussion about real theism. I'll call it real theism. So what I really mean by real theism is the belief that one or more gods objectively exist, have being outside merely our imagination, our ideas, our culture, that they're not mere symbols. It's become very trendy in recent decades, especially in, for example, the New Age community, to believe that to reject belief as it were, and kind of just believe that the gods represent ideas or archetypes, right? I mean, the work of Carl Jung and Freud definitely contributed to this, and I would say it's become kind of the mainstream belief, potentially even the mainstream belief among society at large in certain places. I really think that understanding gods as symbols is useful in a mystical sense. You know, if you really kind of meditate or through some practice or another, find yourself kind of transcending your typical ego and, you know, kind of perceiving archetypes and how they're fulfilled in different mythologies, I think that's useful. But if you get too much into that way of thinking, you're going to find yourself rejecting the fundamentals of belief, and then you're just an atheist, you know. And of course, there's room in the world for atheists. You know, I'm no zealot by any means, but you have to know kind of what you're dealing with, because if you're going to accept the atheist position, if you're going to accept that these gods are merely archetypes, then you can't justifiably participate in any kind of ceremony or ritual or, you know, practice that takes them as real beings, or at least not while being entirely intellectually honest with yourself, I would say. This is related to another thing which I call Pokemonification. I can't remember where I picked up this idea from, but there's a tendency among young people today to want to understand the world by taking all of the things that we encounter and experience and to kind of package them, categorize them into little discrete things that can be carried around and, you know, understood with a microscope or whatever. So they call this Pokemonification because it's like treating disparate things as Pokemon. So for example, you will find, you know, YouTube channels that, you know, kind of have like a little symbol for each different religion or for each different pagan path or something like that, and purport to be able to actually like tell you what everything is about in a simple little digestible thing. It seems to be a tendency of the kind of like the Gen Z mind or of the postmodern headspace. We don't want to do this. We don't want to make the gods into caricatures of themselves. We want to revere and respect them for what they are, which is transcendent beings that have certain, you know, features and lives, right, unto themselves. And this is why I really teach that we need to, in a ritual space, we need to practice reverence and prayer and holiness as part of a holistic spiritual life. This is one of those things where I think people that, you know, come to paganism from Christianity want to leave behind all of that stuff that they didn't like, perhaps, right? And in doing so, they kind of become very irreverent and, you know, they do what's called therapeutic blasphemy, and kind of live a life that doesn't have any sort of submission to higher powers or any kind of ethical teaching at all. So this section has been kind of dispersed, but these are just thoughts that I have about how we should approach the divine writ large, how we should approach ritual space writ large, and how we should be thinking of ourselves as religious people. So now I'd like to introduce, and I call it Dionysianity, right? It's not a parody of Christianity. That's the first thing, because it sounds like one, and if you, at first glance it kind of sounds like one, and I'll explain what I mean. But it's not a parody. It's not like we're making fun of another established religion, as much as it's really a syncretic kind of ideology here, because we're essentially taking the singular God of Jesus Christ and replacing him with one manifestation of a Hanatic transcendent deity in the form of the ancient Greek deity Dionysus, whose mythology presents him in much the same way as the son of the high god begotten by a woman. And this is the reason I'm introducing this to you, is because this is one example of how you can adopt a pagan belief. It's not like you don't convert to paganism. You have certain conceptions of the world, and I'd like to share mine with you, my thoughts on the transcendent god Dionysus, in whom we as Dionysians have our being, and lay our lives down on the ground for this great being. It has everything to do with uncircumcising your mind. If you want to see yourself as rejecting Christianity, then don't reject religion, don't reject reverence, but reject the circumcision and have an uncircumcised mind that lets you be free from all control. This is very much like Christianity, in fact, in the sense that Christianity teaches salvation from sin. We're teaching salvation from illusion, which is much the same thing, because sin exists, mistakes exist, violations of the divine will exist, and they're all motivated fundamentally by illusion. I think so anyway. I mean, some people might just be really born evil, but, what are we going to do with them? That's a problem that presents itself no matter what your belief is. But anyway, the idea is that much of Christian theology, that is to say mystical theology, is actually from the pre-Christian mysteries. Brian Mururesku wrote the book The Immortality Key, link below, showing that essentially Jesus Christ fulfills the mythological role of Dionysus, coming down from heaven to walk among men, turning water into wine. And in my view, really, the Christian eschaton is something that is expressible in Dionysiac terms, where the faithful, or those who understand and are willing to be enlightened by the descent of the god, are going to inherit a renewed creation in which they can live their lives without any kind of fear, as it were. I even have kind of come up with a version of the creed that kind of presents it all like this. But anyway, the real distinction between, a traditional Christian and what I'm calling the gospel of Dionysus is essentially that my God is not a jealous God. There's no kind of, you're going to face divine wrath for not being one of us. Right? That's exactly what I mean by the uncircumcised mind you, is that the fundamental difference between, following kind of like a pagan worldview and following something more Abrahamic, or even something from the world religions of other places, is that I'm not out here telling you that you have to believe what I believe in order to, have a happy afterlife or be a fulfilled human being. I'm just telling you that I have a religious worldview that I have, because it's not dogma. There's no faculty by which someone is telling you that there's a specific interpretation that you have to have, or else be, cast out from the group and believed to not have something that you should spiritually have, right? What we have are traditional hymns, poems, attestations that present a particular view of particular figures. It's not a fossilized dogma. I think the biggest mistake that people make when thinking about paganism, whether they consider themselves pagans or not, but when they try to think about the polytheistic worldview, they tend to assume that, there's a pantheon of gods that are presented as more or less, equal, and we have to, worship the collective, and it's almost like the 12 Olympians, or the 9 Aesir, or whatever it might be, that they together constitute like one god, like they're gonna Power Ranger, they're gonna form up into Metatron, Enoch Metatron. They're gonna form up, into and form like the god out of like 5 parts, like Exodia the Forbidden One or something. And I'm sure there are some people that have that kind of belief system, but it's not typical. It's not, I don't think it's typical. It's not what I have, and it's not what I think most people that kind of come to a mystical understanding or become initiated really walk away believing in so much. I think it's more likely that anyone initiated into the mysteries will have kind of a Hanatic view of the Godhead. But anyway, you have individual cults of individual gods. So what I'm talking about as Dionysianity is merely the cultic veneration of Dionysus in particular, which is fulfilling sort of the role that a religious dogma or a particular religion might fill. It provides everything needful to the faithful of that particular group to kind of have a spiritual life, without needing to assert itself within the larger system as if it were the only truth, the only way, the only thing. And a lot of this has to do with orthopraxy. People always say this. I didn't understand it until recently. People always say that the pagans are not concerned with orthodoxy. They're concerned with orthopraxy. They're concerned with specific rites that have to be carried out in a particular way. And it's very true. And I didn't understand it, really, until I underwent my initiation. Because what it really boils down to is that people will experience something together and will not come to the same conclusions about it. And they don't need to come to the same conclusions about it. I mean, we could get academic and start doing academic theology and maybe start kind of critiquing each other's positions, but ultimately that's not necessary. I think the same, I think the very earliest Christians probably would have said the same thing, because I do believe that Christianity started as a mystery religion. Who needs to speculate about the nature and the hypostases and the will and energy of the Godhead? Why is that necessary for salvation or for achieving the happy result of proper practice? It's not really. The rites, the rituals, when properly performed, contain everything that one needs to know about the nature of the gods in question. Orthopraxy is our theology. It's a mystical initiatory theology. And we believe what we pray. We believe what we practice.